Hey there, it's Ben from patternprofits.net. As we discussed last week, head and shoulders pattern did play out and we did get the flush lower. Anchored VWAP from the September low did hold as support as well as came down tested even below the 50% retracement on the fib there, recovered late on Friday. Now we look for a swing low over 309.61 gets us a swing low on the daily. You'll look for the volume shelf point of control there to be reclaimed. I have two descending trend lines. One's on a closing basis and one takes into consideration the wicks. So we'll have to see if we can push through those. Anchored VWAP off the high just above as well. You may notice that my moving average clouds now change colors. This was an upgrade from Trend Spider, and so now I've kind of changed the settings. So what you're looking at in the green up here is 1020 moving average and 5065 simple moving average below. So when they do cross, when the faster one gets below the slower moving one, it will turn red. So just a cool upgrade from Trend Spider. Thank you to my buddy Ripster for those. Really enjoy using those. Makes my charts clean and really easy to see what's going on. We also have bullish divergence here on the daily. This is kind of how these end. If you look in the past, we've seen those a couple times where price makes a lower low, the RSI does not. So you have bullish divergence. We've seen a couple of those. You go back historically, you'll see even more of those, both at tops and bottoms. The one on the weekly was very pronounced on this. I shared that on FinTwit. What's interesting too, by the way, the QQQ on the weekly did tag oversold early on Friday. What's interesting is the SPY didn't quite come down and touch that anchored VWAP off the low. It didn't make a new low on Friday either, and also printed a swing low. So now we just look for anchored VWAP from off the high to be reclaimed, push through the moving average clouds above, and the SPY looks well ahead. Had bullish divergence down here, but looks in much better shape as compared to the tech-heavy Qs. Let's go right into some individual stocks that I'll be watching into next week. CPE and GroupMate, CHX. Let me actually get these off. Extended here. What I'm going to be really interested to see. It's quite extended. CHX is another one, quite extended. Most of these energy, oil, and gas names are quite extended. If we do get a bounce in the Qs and tech and growth in general does bounce, going to be interesting to see if energy comes in and pulls back and we come back and test some of maybe the pivot, or we test some of these clouds that are lower or anchored VWAP from below, or come in to these prior pivots. Or are they all going to rally together? That would be quite impressive if everything gets a lift here going forward. If we have indeed seen a bottom in the growth sector, which got hit much heavier. What I kind of am looking for, expect, and what makes the most sense to me is to see the energy names that are quite extended come in as growth and tech make a bit of a rebound. That's something to look for early next week. One group that's held up better than most, Futu. We said we were going to watch to see if how that acted early in the week. It did held up much better than most. Most are down here below or at their 50-day. Futu didn't quite come down there, and tag that. Also in the group, TIGR, they call this one the Robin Hood of China. This one did come down. It found support at the 65 MA there, and then if you bring this over, you can kind of see the volume shelf there as well, held as support. Now we look for the swing here. So over 2130 will give you a daily swing, and then you have QFIN in the group also, which again, with a lot of the other ones trading still down or below their 50-day, this one's way up high. So that group, worth keeping an eye on into next week, showing relative strength, and they all have very good fundamentals behind them. So when you see that kind of relative strength in them doing something different from everything else, you want to definitely keep an eye on those if the market indeed finds its footing. Another one, YY. What I like about this one is it held the pivot perfectly, a little bit extended from the pivot now after the bounce. But what you want to do is really focus on the ones that are doing something different from everything else. HZNP is another one. Um, you had the gap and it actually held that level. As you can see, this chart is a little sloppy over here, but looks a lot different from everything else we're looking at, and even held this 86.67 pivot, still in buying range, volume shelf just below. Outside of that, another one that's held up really well, Lovesac. Anchored VWAP from the gap back here holds once again. 65 MA was right there. It actually closed, reclaimed the 50. Now you're sitting on volume shelf point of control. Needs a push through there, push back above the cloud. But this is, and you kind of look at this as a bit of a broadening formation. I think I may have covered this in the past, but held to form. So now you look for the swing here over 55.89, maybe get your run back up to here. And if the market's healthy, maybe even a push through there. Outside of that, and Love also very good, all of these good fundamentals behind Huya. Held, this stock just drives me crazy. I can never get it right. Held anchored VWAP off the low. You do have a pivot here, 27.56. So down here on Friday, even a little bit on Thursday, shook out the IBD crowd. Look at that long-legged doji candle to close, actually made a swing. So 27.56, a level of interest above. That was the prior pivot. And then you're in the pinch here. So we'll see how that one acts throughout the week. You have a bunch of stocks too in the focus list that held the 50. While some cracked and broke below, some found that area of support and bounced. Rada was one. And the reason I point these out is you can really take an entry tight against the 50 and 65 when the market's, really looking ugly, but then starts to firm up. A lot of times the ones that do hold that level are the ones that bounce the fastest. WSC, this is another one, held the 50, 65, and then the XTI. Here's another one, and this is when you do one of these anchored VWAPs from the gap, I like to leave them on there, and this is exactly why. You see that much later, that can act as support when the market comes in and was acting very healthy here, but then the market rolls over and you have this big breakout here. Where does it find support? It found support at the anchored VWAP, from the prior earnings gap. So you've got little volume shelf there too, lower here. And then if you come into the more recent action, you now have this kind of pinch setting up. And you know how we like to play these is get into the pinch closer to the one off of the gap or off of the low at the lower end. Take some profits as they come up and tag the one off of the high. And then if they push through, either add on or you can ride that position ideally to new highs. Another one I want to talk about, Yalla. Yalla had an incredible run off here as it broke through the 23.18 pivot, monster move. If you took some profits in here, we talked about it, came back, did not hold the pivot, but did end up holding the anchored VWAP and volume shelf from the IPO. So this is the anchored VWAP from the IPO. It served as support. That's also your largest area, volume shelf, concentration of volume there. So we'll look and see if that could make the term and reclaim that 23.18 pivot. I believe you have earnings, not next week, but the following week, late in the week. So maybe a pre-earnings run here if the market gets healthy. Speaking of those power earnings gaps, I do have quite a few. Let's see, WD. Now you'll notice all of these are going to look completely different from the stuff that we just looked at on the focus list. WD40 power earnings gap, holding that, as bad as the market was, it held that anchored VWAP from the gap. This is why I say to, focus on those and don't take them off your chart. SIVB, another one, just holding that late, even in the ugly action Thursday and Friday. Again, holding that level. And surprisingly, Google, as much as a beating that tech took, it held up actually very, very well. Right up here above anchored VWAP off of the gap earnings back here, and just off all-time highs. So despite the heat that the tech sector was taking, Google actually looks really good, especially if they get their act together. Soon, another one, Canada Goose, an old high flyer. Another gap here, anchored VWAP held despite the ugliness late last week. I've got a few more of these worth keeping an eye on. If you've raised a lot of cash, you're underinvested, and the market does take a turn, looks healthy early next week. These are some of the ideas and plays that you can keep risk really tight and start slowly getting back involved. We can't get a follow-through day until Wednesday or later, but there are some, if you wanted to put on some pilot positions and test things to see how they work, these are always a good idea, which is why I keep them on your radar. WD here, same type setup. Synaptics. Another one, you'll notice how this looks completely different from everything else that we discussed earlier that was trading down here around the 50 and 65-day moving average. These are up near the highs still. A couple more. CRTO held up very well. This one actually just below anchored VWAP, but it's flat. So you can look for that to reclaim anchored VWAP. Daily swing is 31.87, so above 31.87 there. That one comes out and goes to try to reclaim anchored VWAP off of this. It was a huge volume power earnings gap. It closed weak, but the action was very strong after until the market rolled over. So that one's showing relative strength as well. Just a couple more here. Sono. This is another one that I can't seem to get right, but very, very tight there. If you bring volume shelf over, just like that, anchored VWAP, look for the reclaim. You've got volume shelf to act as support just underneath. This one, a lot of people seem to like. Keep putting it on my radar. It did reclaim that anchored VWAP off of the gap. This is another one that had a big beat and a strong volume, looked really good in the gap, and then closed weak. Maybe that was a sign of what was to come, with the market, but now has reclaimed that anchored VWAP. So that one you can take really tight. And then one more, surprisingly, is C's. Again, big volume, had the power earnings gap, anchored VWAP, danced around it, has reclaimed now, and that one is just off highs. So we'll see how the market acts if we get a follow-through day Wednesday or later of next week, and it won't take much action, much strength early in the week to get a swing after we saw that big recovery on Friday. I hope this gives you guys some ideas, especially if you're heavy in cash, which I know a lot of us are. but gives you some ideas if the market does decide to get healthy again. Hope you guys have a great trading week, and I'll see you over on FinTwit.